introduction said, I've been working in infrastructure for the last few years. I've been lucky enough to work in transport, water, energy, up and down the East Coast on some pretty large infrastructure projects in both planning and delivery. I guess over the years I've sort of watched as I've gone into clients' offices or potentially just been in a project, and that same old thing just kept coming up. Please just go and do a newsletter. Please can you just go and do a door knock? Just let them know it's happening, it'll all be fine. So I've got a little bit frustrated with that, and I've got a, like everybody in the room, a big passion for changing that, and we've certainly heard that over the presentations over the last 2 days. And unfortunately I missed some of those because obviously there were some clashes, but today I'm really going to walk you through looking at the future of engagement technologies, but also just working through a framework, which is a strategic foresight framework, which gives you an ability to plan long term. It looks at the mega trends and how they're impacting communications going forward, and how we can actually use strategic foresight to plan some of our projects. So I'm going to work through the strategic foresight framework, and I'm going to look at 3 different mega trends, and then I'm actually going to move on to an exercise for yourselves at scenario planning, and how we can actually use the strategic foresight framework to actually help us plan through and identify things that might be impacting our projects. So I'm going to first start with why the change today. Why have we got something that is different? Why is communication changing? Has anybody in the room heard of Industry 4.0? Love it. We're going to be friends. So the Industrial Revolution 4.0, otherwise known as the Age of Transformation, the digital age, there's a few different names out there. Essentially the first 3 industrial revolutions gave us mechanisation, electricity, and then the early forms of electronics. Industry 4.0 is sort of a culmination of these things coming together. It's actually the technologies changing so that we can actually apply what we know, the electronics, and actually look at the transformation of how we operate, how we work, how we live. So strategic foresight, how does that work? Strategic foresight enables us to plan long term. There's one thing that you can certainly be certain of over the next few years, and that is uncertainty. The fact is we're living in a time of change. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all going to be about technology. But the way that we operate, the way that we live is different. The technology is coming together, and there is now exponential change. So there's a law called Moore's Law, which is where the technology continues to advance exponentially, and we're pretty much at the end of that stage now. So now we're looking at how that technology can actually be used. So I use the analogy of a storm. When I was a kid, I used to stand there with my dad, and we used to look out across the horizon. It was actually probably a small backyard. But we used to look up, and I used to know the different types of clouds. I used to know what they meant. I used to be able to look and see what type of wind was coming. Was it going to get really ferocious? Did we need to cover up the car because there was a green cloud? Did we need to tie down the trampoline? My kids have gone out. They look, they've got all the indicators in BOM to say where the storm is, what's coming, whether or not it's got hail, whether or not the cool car in the driveway is still going to get damaged, and they still don't tie down the trampoline. So strategic foresight is a little bit like that. It's looking at the indicators around the world and going, and from different industries, different jurisdictions to the ones that you're in, and looking at how there are changes coming. It looks at foresight rather than hindsight. So a lot of the planning that we do looks at a probable future. So when we sit down and we develop a vision and we develop our strategy, we have a probable future. But there's other futures out there that we may miss. So with strategic foresight, we're able to look at what other possible futures are out there, what other plausible futures are out there, and indeed which is the preferred future. So whether or not you're in planning or delivery, you can actually identify a number of different ways that you can plan where you're going. So what it means is that it actually just enables us to become a little bit more creative, think through some other influences that might be affecting our projects and how our communications fits into that. So strategic foresight is a growing area of expertise. There are many, many different frameworks out there. This is a very simplistic version that I've developed especially for this workshop today. But it's really just pared down in terms of giving you an overview of how strategic foresight works. There are many, many different frameworks out there. We've all got Google, you can see them. But I'm just going to run through how this works for community engagement. So like all of our planning, we always start with our screening of our environment. How does it look with political, environment, economic, social, technological, and there's probably a few others that you can throw in there. What is actually happening within the confines of our project, be it planning or delivery, whichever one it is, what's actually influencing the environment around that project. With strategic foresight, the second part of that is looking at the mega trends, which I'm going to go into today. And there's a bunch of other tools in here where you can go through and analyse what else is going on. So what else is happening, not only within your project, but within the general environment of your project to impact your project. This will start to make sense in a minute when I pull up some examples, and I know it's a little bit theoretical at this point. The next part is we then take all that analysis and we start to form the scenarios. We look at different options that we can pull together, where things may go and what those things may impact. In developing those scenarios, you actually extend the options for where it could possibly go. We then go into strategy, into planning. Once we've got our strategy, we actually flick back and we put our strategy through our 4 scenarios. I'll come back to this. And then we develop the actions. The actions going forward in order to drive that pathway. So if you've ever been in a project and you're sitting there and you're going, geez, I just know that if we could drop the newsletter and we actually went and did some face-to-face engagement, we could get to a different point. It's sort of just driving your future as to where you want to go. With strategic foresight, it's also about understanding the drivers of change in the general context of the global environment. So these are 6 drivers of change that are constantly referred to that have been developed by the Institute for the Future. And I'm just going to hone in on 3 of those because they sort of impact the 3 mega trends that I'm going to go through today. And the first one is the new media ecology. So essentially, with the sophistication that we've got in video development software, augmented reality or mixed reality as it is now, a number of different technologies, our media ecology is becoming incredibly diverse. We have a new vernacular for communication. So the most basic element of that is the picture versus the long printed word. So people don't read anymore. The computational world is the sophistication of the senses. So around probably around this building, there's a number of different sensors that are happening. Many of you have got a smartwatch like I do, your smartphone, the CCTV, all of those sensors coming together provide us with a huge amount of data. What we have had up until now is a lot of data that we don't really know what to do with. We go to conferences, we hear a lot about big data, but we don't really know what to do with it. The coming years are going to show us and it will give us an ability to use that data. And the last one is a globally connected world, which really talks for itself. I think we all know how connected the world is getting. So I was recently, just to put this into some perspective, I was recently at a presentation by Gary Wright, the Chief Planner for New South Wales, and he was talking about the mega trends and how they're impacting on planning itself within New South Wales and how they're taking those into consideration. And one of the things he commented on was the use of shopping centre, and he said we still plan for shopping centres. So we all know the advent of online shopping, the shopping centre is not as it was. It doesn't necessarily mean that the shopping centre is dead. Yes, there are a number of different shopping centres in America that are dead, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can mean that it's a community hub. And he said, as planners, when we're telling the story, we have to remember these things and we have to get our head around community hub versus shopping centre. I was talking to somebody earlier on in the conference from one of the regional councils, and the other thing that Gary mentioned was the rise in the middle class in Asia and how that's impacting on regional New South Wales. And the reason for that is that middle class Asia apparently loves chocolate, so they're starting to grow orchards of hazelnut trees throughout regional New South Wales, where they weren't getting a lot of return on some of their crops. So it is interesting to see the impact of something in a completely different jurisdiction on those communities. So I'm going to stick to the conference themes of trust, connection, and hopefully some potential. But I'm just going to go through three of the mega trends. So trust is changing to a dispersed model. It is declining, and it is opening up potential. The last thing I want to do is stand up here and say it's all gloom and doom. It's not. There's potential there. So the evolution of trust, this is some work that was done by Rachel Botsman. And she's looked at how the local trust, it used to be individual to individual. So when we were in small villages, it used to be I knew who to go and trade my eggs with, which person who had the milk, who didn't water down the milk, that I would trade my eggs with them for the milk. That then went, as our cities got larger, it went very institutional. We started believing in government and our academic institutions. And so the trust evolved a little bit more. Now, with the advent of things like eBay, Uber, we trust in anyone. Trust can be anywhere. It's incredibly distributed. It can flow in various directions. We can trust our peers, our colleagues. So it is quite a different distributed model. What does this mean for communication? People are not going to one source. Our communication is incredibly fragmented. And we know this, and we're seeing it every day, and we just need to ensure that we're not doing something like just going and doing a newsletter. Another piece of research is the Edelman barometer. Anybody track the Edelman barometer at all? Yep. Another one up the back. Absolutely fascinating. So the Edelman barometer has tracked the significant movements in trust for the last 20 years. So in 2006 was the first time it became trust was in a person like me. So trust between individuals was very, very strong, and it was the first time that it actually overcame a trust in government. In 2007, business for the first time became more trusted than government and media. And the one trend that has been continuously focused on through the 20 years is the continual decline in media. By 2018, less than 50% of people actually trusted in media. In 2019, my employer is the most trusted. So people are almost returning to that village mentality and looking at their local village to see how they can influence change. What can their employers do to change the things that they truly believe in? So how can they change the world around them? In Australia, these are Australian statistics by the way, but in Australia, government and media are still distrusted, and we have no institution in trustor territory at the moment. However, in 2019 was the first time that media actually had an increase. So it'll be interesting to see with fake news what's happening with that, and whether or not we actually go back into trusting media. And there's another tool within strategic foresight, which most of you know is the Pendulum Effect, where we go from having a trust in media, we go off and we've gone and we've trusted in social media, are we going to go back to media? So it'll be interesting to watch the patterns over the next few years. I did go and try and find who is trusted, so that we had a bit of a positive aspect on this. And it is still the professions, but interestingly, this was the Ipsos Global Trust Survey, by the way, and interestingly, it's still ordinary men and women. Not so trustworthy. So given the Banking Commission, some of the sexual harassment cases in the church, obviously politicians, everybody loves them, and no surprises here with the federal election. I bet they wanted these results before that. But ironically, as Rachel Botsman says, we trust wholeheartedly in the internet too much. So remember, I said we've changed the vernacular of how we talk, the more that we get into videos and images and things like that. So Columbia University has found that 6 in 10 people don't actually read the tweets that they actually share, which is pretty scary. So hence the beauty of fake news. You've had that experience? Yep. And for Facebook, the University of Illinois, found that 62% of Facebook users thought that their news stream just came from their lovely friends and family and weren't aware of the algorithm. So the issue with the algorithm coming in, as many of you may know, is the fact that people end up in a bubble. So whilst they're searching for information on the same thing over and over again, the algorithm starts to kick in and feed them more information to reinforce those ideas. So I was recently given the example where somebody said to me, I really wanted to go to the Elton John concert, but I'm way too young to like Elton John, so I didn't know it was around. And I thought that's actually an interesting thing from a marketing perspective, how you actually beat the algorithm. So I'm not sure how many of you saw this. I found this an absolutely fascinating example in terms of how we're working. This was the Australia Youth Coal Coalition. During the recent Australian climate protests, put out this Facebook post, and this was the mess that had been left behind in Hyde Park. However, this was a photo from Hyde Park in London 6 months earlier. They went on to say that they had cleaned up the mess that the climate protesters had left, and Adani had sponsored the cleanup. So Facebook pulled these two comments down after 24 hours because it was obviously fake news. But my point is, you can't un-Google yourself. Both of these posts are very, very widely available to every single one of us. And we have to ensure that the transparency is so inherent in our projects, our organisations, that it becomes natural. It's not a forced thing. Because the minute that you try and fake it, You are out there. It's there. I'll just wait for them to talk if it's in the room. It's a good one. Which probably leads quite nicely into the second megatrend around connection. So I've taken connection for myself as being connection to the internet. I think we're pretty aware of how connected we are. And if none of you have ever been to the Internet Live Stats site, go onto it. It's absolutely mesmerising. So it actually clocks up the stats as you go through, but it does waste a lot of time at work. So, so the internet obviously has been, it's absolutely no secret that it has been one of the biggest changes for communication going forward. But it's given rise to the digital tribe and the keyboard warrior. So I'm pretty sure that every one of us has experienced, I guess, the anonymity of being able to comment on anything from behind the keyboard. It's very easy not being face to face. This is the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in the state. It's a fascinating case study. The protest group were there for well over 2 years protesting against an oil pipeline that crossed an Indigenous reservoir, and they put a reach out into the global community. People came from around the world, like literally around the world, and went and camped there for quite some time. There's stories of marriages, kids, you name it, over those 2 years. Unfortunately, the ending was not a great one, but I'll leave you to Google that one. But without the ability to connect and use the social media that they did, they certainly wouldn't have got the global reach that they had. Obviously, more locally, many of us are familiar with Lock the Gate. So again, Drew Hutton formed the group in the early days and was able to attract attention and raise the profile of many of the projects that he felt were causing environmental damage, again using the digital tribe. On a much smaller scale, this is actually a Brisbane example of a construction hole that was left there 20 years ago. And the local council obviously found some money in the budget and thought, oh, that's right, we left that construction hole there 20 years ago, we're going to go in and fix it and we'll fill it in. But they didn't actually go out into the community where the hole was. They arrived with trucks. The water hole in the middle of a drought had actually long filled with water. Had been filled with water for many, many years. It was an absolute haven for the local animals that were using it. It was in the middle of an environmentally aware community. So as you can see, it's surrounded by trees and there's local national parks and rides through the bushland. So within 24 hours, they had a major protest group on site protesting against this, and council at much expense had to redesign the entire pond to actually deliver something that was going to maintain the local flora and fauna. I guess my point around all of these, because it's not new, we know all of this, we've seen it happen, it's happened on our projects, but the point is the transparency. The fact is that if you have an environmental spill or a dust example that happens on your projects, other people will know before you do. Because they will be there, they will photograph it, and they will post it, and they will put it out. And at the moment, the need, the connection, and the lack of trust means that everybody is responsible. So from project managers through to CEOs, everybody needs to be aware of their actions going forward. Here's another two really good examples, and just connecting back with that trust piece around the employer. So Google had 20,000 employees walk out in protest against their colleagues who had experienced either sexual harassment in the workplace or unequal pay. So again, this was a digital tribe looking to their employer to actually enforce change. The other one is the Australian Engineers Declare movement. I'm not sure, has anybody been tracking these guys? So they have recently put a lot of pressure on the engineering and construction firms around their involvement with Adani. And some of the biggest firms have actually refused to work with Adani due to this movement. Again, employees looking for change, going, it's actually not good enough. We don't trust the government to stop Adani, we'll do it. The last one is my favourite, and that's the Internet of Things, which, for anybody who's not aware, Internet of Things is basically the accumulation of all of the different data sensors that are out there in the community. So it can be the smart cities to smart houses, absolutely anything you can actually pull together, and it pulls together all the data and the sensors. It has the ability to help us understand patterns like we never had before. So this is actually my life. So if you're wondering why it says grandma, mother, daughter, this is how I like to look at it. So I live with an early adopter. My husband loves technology, probably far more than I do. And so our house is completely full of it. Certainly when I grew up, I was a front door key, was it a latchkey kid that we used to get called, yeah? I was one of those. We now have fingerprints to get into our front door. My mum used to track me as to whether or not I got home, if she could ring the landline. I actually now, if I'm not tracking my kids on the Google app, on Maps, my front door actually tells me they've come home. So, I know. The other day, I left the fridge door open and my husband rang me and he said, you've left the fridge door open. I went, okay, we're going too far now. I'm not going to clean out the fridge anymore. So I guess the reason I'm telling you this is it impacts on the way that we communicate. It impacts, if we're doing online shopping, if we're grabbing our groceries, the shopping centre is no longer the place for us to go. The hairdresser is always the good one because I think we'll still keep going there, but it does impact on the way that you communicate with communities going forward. And what will that mean for my kids? What will that be in the future? And these guys are going to play a big part in it, like it or not, they're here. Alexa is transforming. There are bots that are out there that are incredibly useful and have a lot of different, applications, and we're starting to see that age of transformation coming through. So they have the ability to help us monitor our water use in the home, our energy use. But on top of that, for grandma, if we go back to grandma, has anybody received that phone call? Julie, I can't use this Skype thing. Nobody? No? Yeah. So your parents, you're on some sort of internet called IT call number or something, will be gone because they will be able to say, Bob, please call Julie. That they will actually be able to assist grandma with the technology that she doesn't understand. For visually impaired people, it means that the bot can actually read the script. For grandma who forgets to take her medicine, it's reminding her they're starting to have visual ability to see whether or not grandma's actually taking her medicine or not, or whether or not she's already taken it and she's trying to take it again. And probably, the really sad one is the fact that they're actually addressing the issue of loneliness, which is a whole other mega trend. But, ethics aside, imagine the collection of data. So as a data sensor, these are the ABS statistics that we absolutely dream about. these are the things that we really want to know. Like, imagine if we could go into a community and we knew that there was 5 different languages because they changed the language on the bot. That there were shift workers because of the times when they changed their lights. Or, more importantly, that there were people with health issues that were dust and noise sensitive. So certainly something like the opportunities are limitless. Also, interestingly, the reason that they design them with big eyes is so that we trust them. They also make them as small children or smaller than us, so again, we trust them. And they've done studies, particularly around some of the bots that are used in the military, to show how humans actually trust in bots more than they trust in another human. So, do we have them at information sessions? Or do we forget the information sessions and we actually blast the information out into people's homes? Don't know. But it's not off the table. So we'll go back to the strategic foresight framework. That's the bit that I really love, and I could go on for another 10 hours, but clock's telling me otherwise. So we're just going to go, I'll just show you how we do scenarios, and then at each of the tables, we're actually going to try and build some scenarios. So the scenario setting process, it's not overly different to anything that you guys are used to. So let's grab hold of our project or a particular aspect of our project which we have a problem with. So for this instance, I'm going to suggest to you guys that we say, what are the engagement techniques of the future? What have you guys been experienced to thinking outside of the square that you think may change in the coming years? The first thing that we do within the strategic foresight is look at the axis of uncertainty. So there's actually another very complicated step before this where you kind of map out some of your areas of uncertainty and you pick 2. Identifying the axis of uncertainty, we're then able to develop the plausible scenarios. And then consider the pathway of action towards where we want to go. What do we actually want to do with this information? So remember, we've analysed things, we've looked at the environment, we've looked at the mega trends, we've looked at what's going on in the world, and we go, okay, trust is really going to affect stakeholder and community engagement. Connection is going to make a big difference. What are we as practitioners going to do about it going forward? How do we make sure that it's going to be the best thing possible? So, in this situation, I've just put trust and connection here as being high. So if we do have trust and connection as both being incredibly high, let's go back to that example of the bots. Everybody's happy to have a bot in their home. They're more than happy to give us all their data. We're all connected, everything's happening. What can we do in that situation? In another situation where people are not connected and they're all living off the grid, they don't want to have a bot in their home and they stop giving to ABS. ABS statistics get worse than they currently are. What would happen in that situation? Or perhaps there's an interim inside. So I've chosen this one. If at your table you want to do something different, that's fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and plan out some scenarios. And you may want to just focus on one possible scenario here. But the best way to think about it is creating like a headline, or a lot of people who use this technique look at movie titles or books, because it creates something in your head. It's the narrative. You're trying to create the narrative around what that looks like. What does that world look like? Think about the trends in each of those scenarios. You guys have seen change happening. You've seen it in the news, you've felt it on your projects, you know it as well as I do. So what are the trends in here? And who are the stakeholders that are affected? So within Australia, we obviously have completely polarising areas of connection. such a vast country. We have areas who don't have any connection at all. I've also walked onto many a rural property that seems to have more IT than a government department. And obviously there's the socio-economic void there as well. So we're all happy to do that. So over to you guys.
So we were talking about phasing out single newspaper for works notifications, flyers, newsletters, etc. So we were talking about maybe in the future, rather than having single use notifications, it could pop up on your smart fridge. So we were saying how, while that could increase the level of connectedness because you could interact with the survey or click that you've read it, or it could be tailored or personalised to your specific house, we thought that that would actually reduce trust because it would almost be seen as spam coming straight to you and you lose that personalised aspect of it.
Yeah. Beautiful. Anybody else? There's another reading table. That one?
They're all good tables.
That one you got to see. Okay, as we've all got like really shy engagement people in the room. I'm just going to demonstrate, and I apologise if you can't see this or me now. Essentially what we do is we come up with the 4 scenarios, and sometimes I'm working with one client at the moment who has an issue in 2029 that we're trying to address. They've got, I was really hoping I could tell you, but it's a little bit sensitive, where they've got a massive issue in 2029, a lot of complex stakeholders. We worked through a number of different scenarios and eventually came down to 4, but you can come up with a few more beforehand. So you come up with the 4 scenarios, you develop your strategy. So you're going to look at this and go, okay, in the same way that we always do, what are we going to do? How are we going to make this happen? How are we going to solve this program? How are we going to address this project? But you come up and you put it back through the scenarios. So what are the actions or the risks or the mitigations that we need to do should scenario number 1 plan out? What's actually going to happen with that? Then number 2, number 3, number 4, and eventually you start ruling it out and go, yep, we've got a really solid strategy here. We know exactly what we're going to do. And they talk about, I guess, that cone of uncertainty, and the fact is you can start to then track. And if I go back here, maybe, the backcasting behind the scenarios, you can actually go back and start going, how are we going to get to 2029? So what are the steps that we need to take between now and 2029 in order to make that happen? And my hope is that as practitioners we can start to take them on that journey. So I'm just going to stop talking there and just leave you with the message that it's not all gloom and doom going forward. I had a conversation with the person who's in the room at the moment a little bit earlier around the pendulum effect and how that's happening, and at the end of the day we all want to connect. So I don't think it's all going to come down to technology. We are humans, we want human interaction, and we know that one of the other mega trends is loneliness. It's massively impacting our communities. So I'm absolutely fascinated with how that works with us as practitioners going out into communities and what that means going forward. But it's not all gloom and doom, and it will be exciting. And just make sure that you are the storm going forward. So thank you.
Love a microphone in an audience. We do have 11 minutes and 37 seconds if there are any questions. There's one up the back. I've got to multitask. Look at this. One up the back. Beautiful. Your name, please. Any question?
My name's Linda from Darwin in the Northern Territory. Thank you very much. It was a really great presentation, but I feel this remains still a little Bewildered, thank you. Could you please give us a demonstration of that quadrant and how you might see some of those
11
scenarios
minutes.
fleshed out? Just
Yeah.
briefly would be
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Is this easiest? So I guess I really, and I think I really threw everybody with the question. I was trying to go, let's do the conference, but it's a lot easier when you come down to your project and you know your project and what's happening. So, but essentially, you're tracking impacts. You're tracking impacts and the trends that are happening. So if we look at, we have trust and connection, which way around? Trust. Yeah. Trust and connection. So was there a group over here that was doing, it was you guys that was doing the bots, wasn't it, at the back? That looked at the bots? No, you were doing the newsletters?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, we need bots providing information to people.
In here?
Put it, it was in the low. The bot would probably move it a little bit higher. It doesn't, yeah, not too much trust,
Up
but
here?
yeah, just
Yeah.
down there. If you create the bot to be
Yeah.
tailored towards the,
So essentially, maybe I should stop focusing in on the detail. Essentially, if you have high trust in, and go back to the trends of what's happening. So if you have high trust in your employer, what do we do as community engagement people to go out and enable that trust? What actually happens there? And if you've got high connection. So if you go into a community, and certainly that's what the Engineers Declare movement has used. They've looked at where, not necessarily consciously, but if you look at where the trust is sitting, it's sitting with the employer, high trust, high connection, build the digital tribe, they've nailed it. And they've got two massive engineering companies who do work for Adani. If you come down into the high, got myself all confused, sorry, high connection, low trust, well, what does it look like in there? So you have, that to me is probably a really dangerous place in here, because that's where you've got people who are just going to go out, they are connected, they are going to go and give out a whole load of misinformation, and they don't trust you. So, and if you're potentially, was it the waterways people, if they don't trust in what the waterways people are saying, sorry, the authority, whatever it was, if they don't trust in you and what you're saying, that's a really dangerous place to go. So you start to map that out and look at what that scenario does. And it's just a narrative. It's just a story. There is another tool that we use, which is causal layered analysis, which actually builds out that narrative. So once you can actually start building out that narrative and you're telling that story of this is actually what will happen, it becomes a lot easier. So you start to build it out. And then you can start addressing it and mitigating it. Does that make it a little bit clearer? Yeah, I'm happy to come and chat to you afterwards if you want. Any others?
Any other questions?
Yeah.
what are some of the techniques you use to measure trust?
Is that a whole other workshop?
Yeah.
Look, there are a couple of different products out there. Certainly, I would have a look at Dr. Kieran Moffat and what he's done with the CSIRO. So there's a couple of different ways, but yeah, that's a big question. And it's different for every project. So the project that I'm currently working on doing, trust is evident because we've got a very select group of stakeholders, and I can see it in the room, and we can see the change in their attitude and everything that we normally do. and a community-wide project, it's much harder, yeah. But this is designed to help you use the trends. So these guys use recycled paper, and I was saying, you know, there's another project that we're working on which is looking at recycled products in infrastructure. It's absolutely, you know, massive because that's the trend that's going, and I don't mean trend, I mean that's a really big concern for communities at the moment. So that mega trend is actually impacting some of that work. Yeah.
So, just on the trust issue, so I work for a local council, so, and it was quite interesting when you speak about the mega trend and the lack of trust in government, which is quite evident, and we have small pockets of community that will have distrust in whatever you do.
Yeah.
But we identify that as part of the engagement planning process. They don't trust us. First stage of engagement showed they don't trust us. How can we mitigate that? So we were transparent. We did videos. We did survey. We recorded it. We did verbatim minutes. We had open Q&A. We extended engagement for an extra 2 weeks. Still distrust.
Yeah.
You know, so from a, I suppose my takeaway from that is it's about sometimes there's some things even because it isn't.
And you are nailing exactly one of the things that, how do you work with employers? So have a look within your council and go, who are the big employers that we actually have to work with to actually understand what council does and how council works. So it may be something along those lines, but yeah. And trust takes time. That's the other difficult.
Any final questions that can be asked and answered in 4 minutes and 24 seconds? All right. Please join me in thanking once again our wonderful